All guests on ZASLOW Show 2.0 brought to us by the official beer of the program. You know, we're talking Johnny Cuba. How else are we going to enjoy tonight's Thursday night football? Week 11 gets going. Jets, Patriots tonight. Then with an ice-cold Johnny Cuba in our hand, go to johnnycuba.us. You can find the nearest location to you. Make sure you always drink responsibly, and don't forget Johnny Cuba's mantra, stay tranquilo. Jamey Eisenberg, CBS Sports Fantasy Football expert, joins us every Thursday to help us set our lineups. Jamey, it's always good to see you. Every year there's a player who was a big surprise, who was drafted late in the draft, who gives you the incredible value, and as a result, you're one of the best teams in your league. Like, are there one or two of those guys this year?
Drake May, certainly a quarterback, but there's a lot of players there. Daniel Jones, Sam Darnold. I think May was the one that was getting drafted. But Daniel Jones obviously has been in that category as well. Running back wise, obviously Rico Dowdle. He was a guy that we picked up off waivers, but some people drafted him late. Now you're seeing Trevion Henderson. We may see RJ Harvey fall into that role. I think Rashad White, just because of the Bucky Irving injury, has been good at times. Jordan Mason at times. Probably missing somebody at that spot. Wide receiver, Michael Pittman certainly comes to mind. He was kind of, thought of as an afterthought, I think mostly because Anthony Richardson and the thought of him starting, but he's been, amazing for a good stretch of the season. Tight end, there's been a lot of guys. Probably Dalton Kincaid was the best one prior to his most recent injury, but the hope is that you're finding, a couple of these guys now. We've been talking about that with the trade deadline coming up and in a lot of fantasy leagues, and clearly some of these league winners, how sustainable are they? So like Woody Marks, for example, somebody that can, hopefully turn into one of those players. RJ Harvey, again, now with the J.K. Dobbins injury. Darius Slayton is a guy that I like. I hope he's healthy. He's dealing with a hamstring injury, but, with Jameis Winston starting and what Jackson Dart has done, so you're looking for guys that, really take off at this point in the year.
And who are the guys who, were drafted in the first round who, if you selected him, like your season's been a bust?
The first round guys, probably Brian Thomas has been, it's sort of borderline, I guess where they've been drafted, but Brian Thomas Jr. has been a bust, obviously. AJ Brown, with everything that's going on with him, continues to go on with him. He's been bad. Nico Collins hasn't been, as great as advertised. Obviously Saquon Barkley hasn't been as great as advertised. Tyreek Hill with the injury, but even before the injury, he wasn't performing up to the level that we were hoping for. I'm trying to think of those other like handful of receivers that didn't necessarily pan out. I guess those are the two big ones, Brian Thomas Jr. and Nico. Is
this finally the year where in next year's draft, Derrick Henry's not going to be drafted very high?
I would guess so. Especially if they somehow manage to win the Super Bowl, this might be it for him. But look, he's clearly defied a lot of metrics. Father time being the biggest one. And it's seemingly starting to catch up with him to an extent. He had the 100-yard game against the Dolphins and looked fine, 2 weeks ago. I think if he had scored a touchdown against the Vikings, instead of it going to Justice Hill, nobody would be panicking. And typically anytime you have Lamar Jackson on the field, he's going to be in a good spot because they're going to be in a chance to win. And those are usually when that's usually when he's at his best. So we'll see. I've written him off for like 5 years in a row, and he's just made me look silly for it. So this was the first year I was like, I'm just done. He's just too good. And until he decides to hang it up, I'm just going to say, take him in round 2 and just call it a day.
Are fantasy owners going to wind up getting a treat for the fantasy playoffs with Joe Burrow?
I hope so. There's differing reports. I think we got to keep an eye on what happens these next 2 games. They clearly have had a bad season. Their defense is a mess. They've had some games that they should have won and they lost. They beat the Steelers the last time these 2 teams met. So if they're able to pull off an upset in Pittsburgh, I think that will definitely, reinvigorate him a little more. But look, he wants to play. He's tired of this. If you go back and watch his acceptance speech from the comeback player of the year, he's like, I'm tired of winning this thing. He's won it twice. And so I think he just wants to play, so whether they're out of it or, maybe slim playoff hopes. And like we saw last year, fighting for a chance at the end, I would just imagine that even if they're, eliminated, he's still going to play. So I would hope so. Look, Joe Flacco's averaging 30 points per game. Like, that's number 1 quarterback numbers.
All right, Jamey, let's get to the action for tonight. Jets, Patriots, 8:15. Really feels like last week was the first week where, oh yeah, Thursday night football. This shit sucks. I feel like we're right smack in the middle of the season where these might not be good games anymore. Do you agree? What do you like?
Yeah, this feels like it could be one of them. You're encouraged, I guess, a little bit by the Jets winning 2 straight games, but the Patriots are looking like a very solid playoff team. I don't know if they're a Super Bowl team yet, but a playoff team for sure. And surprisingly enough, may get the 1 seed just based on their schedule and what they've done so far to date. So they should win this game. They should win it handily. I don't really love a lot of Jets. You're starting Brees Hall, but almost by default, the Patriots' run defense has been fantastic. So um, he's the only Jet I would consider. Mason Taylor, just with the quarterback situation being what it is not someone you want to trust yet. No Garrett Wilson. And then for the Patriots, there's really 2 must starts in my mind, 3 if you want to count the defense. But Drake May has just been fantastic, fantasy and reality. Start him against the Jets. This could be the showcase for MVP game. They can allow him to put up some big stats here, which wouldn't be a surprise. And then Trevion Henderson, last week's game was his coming out party, against a really good Bucs run defense. He has the 2 long breakaway runs. But in the last 2 weeks without Ramondre Stevenson, he's been fantastic. I think Stephon Diggs is a borderline starter. If you're desperate, look at Mac Hollins. He's coming off 2 games in his last 3 with at least 7 catches because Kayshon Boutte's been out. Hunter Henry's a maybe start. But really, the Patriots should do whatever they want to in this game.
All right, let's get to the Dolphins here. Sunday morning, 9:30 a.m. They are in Madrid. Dolphins, Commanders. What do we like?
It's weird to say that there's nobody for Washington that you should be looking to start because of what we've seen from the Dolphins defense so far this season. I do think Mariota is a streaming quarterback. He's now started 4 games in place of Jaden Daniels this season. 3 of them, he's been over 20 fantasy points. That kind of puts him in the borderline starting range. So if you are stuck at quarterback this week, he's a good pivot play. But really, outside of Mariota, it's hard to trust Deebo Samuel. In 3 of 4 games with Mariota, he's been 29 receiving yards or less. The Dolphins, I think it mostly has been a byproduct of how teams have run against them, but they have been very good against opposing wide receivers. So you need a touchdown from Deebo to really, I think, count on him. And that's one thing that they've done very well is keeping wide receivers out of the end zone. Zach Ertz is a decent streaming option, but the position is so deep. But the Dolphins have struggled against tight ends. And for Miami, there's 2 must-start guys. Jalen Waddle should destroy the secondary. Every wide receiver has destroyed the secondary. And clearly, Devon Achane is making an argument to be the number 1 running back in football. He's my number 1 ranked running back for this week. But I also like Tua. Look, 2 touchdowns last week. He didn't have a good fantasy day overall because the 2 interceptions and the yardage was low. But this defense is just absolutely abysmal. And so he's, Deron Payne, one of their defenders, not going to be there making the trip because he's suspended. So this should be one of Tua's best games. Now, we always know that sometimes that doesn't materialize because of the run game or, he'll have a mistake or 2. But I'm starting him in several leagues. And I do think that if you're looking at it, talking about playoff possibilities, come back from the bye, gets New Orleans, great matchup, and then the Jets, great matchup. So Tua may actually end up being a decent fantasy quarterback to close the season.
All right, Jamey, let's get to some of the big matchups on Sunday, 1 p.m. Bucks, Bills, both teams coming off of losses last week. What do we like?
I'm hoping for a shootout. You're starting for Buffalo. It's Josh Allen and James Cook. Khalil Shakir is a solid number 3 receiver. Dalton Kincaid probably going to be out. So maybe Keon Coleman has an opportunity to build off last week where he had 8 targets, did score the touchdown against the Dolphins. But the must-start guys are Allen and Cook and Shakir, borderline starter. The Bucks are very interesting because the Bills are top 5 in fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks, number 1 in fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing tight ends. And Cade Otton was just an absolute stud last week. Obviously, Baker Mayfield has been great this year. And he's actually been great in some tough matchups at Houston, at Seattle, against Philadelphia, against Atlanta, which is good against quarterbacks, and last week against New England. He's been over 22 fantasy points in all those games. So I'm still starting Baker. I hope, again, we see Bills score early, Bucks chasing points, Emeka Buka must-start receiver. I like Tez Johnson as a number 2 receiver. He scored 3 touchdowns in his last 3 games, had 2 touchdowns last week. And then Cade Otton, I'm just going to, not even look at the matchup and say I'm starting him. The running backs are tough to trust, which is hard to say because this run defense for Buffalo is awful. Sean Tucker's worth picking up and stashing. Hopefully get Bucky Irving back. He's starting to practice this week, but don't think he's going to play yet in week 11.
Bears and Vikings, Jamey. We believe in the Bears?
I think so. I mean, it's they've been taking advantage of some good matchups. Cincinnati, the Giants, they've been beating up on some bad teams. But I don't know how good Minnesota is right now. They're down one of their key defenders in Jonathan Grenard. Their defense obviously has been very up and down. Brian Flores 1 week will look great like he did against Detroit 2 weeks ago. And then last week, they did a good job against the Ravens, but we've seen some, weird performances from them. I go back to the game in Ireland against the Steelers where they couldn't stop the run. So for the Bears, it's kind of start all the usual suspects. Caleb Williams is a low-end starting quarterback. DeAndre Swift is a must-start running back at this point. And I love Rome Odunze. I know we got burned 2 weeks ago where he had no catches on 3 targets, but they went right back to him. DJ Moore's a little bit banged up. Keep an eye on that because that could open the door for a guy like Luther Burden. Colston Loveland's been good in spurts. Could have a good opportunity here. The Vikings have given up 5 touchdowns to tight ends in their last 5 games. And then for Minnesota, it's just tough to trust J.J. McCarthy right now. So he's really impacting the entire offense. That being said, Aaron Jones was great last week against the Ravens, and he destroys the Bears in his career from Green Bay to Minnesota. Last 13 games against them, he's averaging over 18 PPR points per game, which is elite. So start Aaron Jones and then start Justin Jefferson. And Jordan Addison is a borderline starter. I would sit TJ Hawkinson.
Seahawks and Rams, that's at 4:05 on Fox. What do we like there?
Could be the game of the year. You're looking at the 2 teams that right now, along with the Eagles, have to be considered the favorites in the NFC and maybe to win the Super Bowl just based on how these teams are operating, especially the Rams. So for the Rams, I'm starting the usual suspects, a little bit down on Kyren Williams because the Seahawks run defense has been fantastic, but you're still starting him. Stafford has been a monster. 4 of his last 5 games, over 30 fantasy points, just an absolute stud. Puka Nakua's must-start guy. Devontae Adams must-start guy. And a good sleeper could be Tyler Higbee. Seahawks really struggle against tight ends. On the other side, I'm a little bit concerned about Darnold. Not that I think he's going to stink, but Rams have been good against quarterbacks most seasons. And actually for Darnold, as well as he's playing in reality, in fantasy, in the 9 games, he's been under 20 fantasy points, which is kind of the benchmark we look for in 5 of those 9 games. So he hasn't been the best fantasy quarterback. You hope that they have to throw. You're clearly starting JSN. He's on a historical pace right now. Rashid Shaheed, more of a boom bust flex play. And then I think just in terms of the running backs, they've been just so tough to trust. Zach Charbonnet actually has 5 touchdowns since week 3. Week 3 is the last time Ken Walker found the end zone. So you know what they're doing at this point. They're just not giving Ken Walker chances to score. And the Rams have only allowed 1 touchdown to a running back on the ground so far this year.
Chiefs and Broncos also at 4:25. This is probably a do or die game for Kansas City as far as the division goes.
You got to feel that way. If the Broncos win this game, I believe they'll be up 3 games on
Yep.
Kansas City with at least the first tiebreaker. And so they play them tough. This is a great defense. Doesn't seem like they're going to have Patrick Surtain back. We know Alex Singleton dealing with the cancer scare. So hopefully, he'll be back soon, but not going to play this week. So they're down 2 key defenders. That being said, it's Andy Reid coming off a bye. He's usually great in this spot. So you're starting Mahomes, you're starting Rashee Rice, and I think Travis Kelce is going to make an impact here just because of how the Broncos typically play defense. They're great against the perimeter receivers. Xavier Worthy, you can't play him. He's been miserable since Rice has come back. Keep an eye on Isaiah Pacheco's injury, but Kareem Hunt could be a low-end starting running back. He's got a touchdown in 3 of his last 4 games. He's going to have to score to help your fantasy team. For Denver, Bo Nix looked awful. You mentioned the Thursday night games. Bo Nix looked absolutely awful last week against the Raiders. I would sit him if you can. I would sit Cortland Sutton. I would only start Cortland Sutton and Troy Franklin. I actually like Franklin better in 3 receiver leagues. And then now we get the new running back here. So RJ Harvey's going to most likely start. Dobbins dealing with the foot injury. I'm excited. He's had 1 game so far this season with double digits in carries. It's a tough matchup, but in that game against Cincinnati in week 4, 19 PPR points. So there's huge upside for RJ Harvey for not just this game, but maybe moving forward.
And finally here, Jamie, Sunday night, Lions and Eagles.
Should be a lot of fun. This has typically been the bad spot for the Lions, outdoors in suspect weather. And the Eagles defense looked amazing against the Packers last week. So Jared Goff, low-end starter at best. You're still starting Amon-Ra St. Brown. You're still starting Jahmyr Gibbs. I would try and sit Montgomery if you can, just because he's just been so touchdown dependent. And this doesn't feel like a game where it's going to be best suited for him. Jameson Williams looked fantastic last week. And this is the thing you got to keep an eye on, because Dan Campbell said breakout season coming for him. Well, then Dan Campbell takes over the play calling duties, and we see a lot of different things for Jameson Williams. I don't think he's a must-start receiver, but I think in 3 receiver leagues you should be starting him. Hopefully he has another big game back-to-back weeks, and then you're going to consider him a must-start guy rest away. You got this whole A.J. Brown narrative now going on with the Eagles once again, where he's on the live stream and says, "Don't play me in fantasy," and another day of him expressing frustration, another instance of him expressing frustration.
I don't like the way that he's handling it, Jamie, but why don't they just throw it to him more? He had 3 targets last week.
I don't know if you heard his locker room, appearance with the media this week. He basically said, I appreciate honesty. And he's like, we can't keep asking the defense to carry us. I love that we're winning. I just think we could be better offensively. And he's like, I wasn't calling anybody out. I wasn't saying anything. He goes, I'm just expressing my frustration with how we are playing. And so he's not wrong. They're not scoring a lot of points here. It's not like they're just beating teams over the head. And last season, it probably sounded a little bit weird because the run game was so good and they were scoring a lot of points if he was complaining. So I think you'll probably see a little bit of a squeaky wheel game coming. This is a good matchup for him because the weakness of the Detroit defense is in their secondary. He typically excels against man coverage. They play a lot of man coverage. So it wouldn't surprise me if he's good. You just can't really start him and say, I'm expecting typical A.J. Brown. So I'm treating him as a low-end number 2 receiver. I like Devontae Smith better. Dallas Goedert still borderline must-start tight end. He's just been touchdown dependent, but he scored more times than not. And Jalen Hurts is still a very good quarterback. Just the concern would be is that this game could be a little bit more like what we saw Monday night with 2 good defenses grinding it out against each other, and then you're not getting the high-end production like these 2 teams are capable of.
Great job as always, Jamey. Tell everybody how they can hear you leading up to tonight's game and then this weekend.
You can check us out on our podcast, Fantasy Football Today. You can find it wherever podcasts are available. You can check us out on YouTube as well with the same name, Fantasy Football Today. Check us out, CBS Sports HQ, and then you can always find all of my written content on cbssports.com.
Awesome. Thank you, Jamey. Appreciate you, man.
You're the best, bud.